And today we are starting a brand new series through the book of Ruth. And so we put our heads together and we wrestled and we worked and we came up with a really creative idea for the title, Ruth. And so we're kicking off a brand new series today, and the title of the series is Ruth, a story of redemption. You know, the interesting thing to me about the story of Ruth is when you start reading in chapter 1, you find out fairly quickly that the central character in chapter 1 isn't even actually Ruth, the person who the book is actually named after. The central character in chapter 1 is actually Naomi, her mother-in-law. And in so many ways, Naomi is just like us. She lives in a time in a country that's tumultuous, and she longs and dreams and hopes for a future that's different in her country. She dreams of a time where there'll be a peace and prosperity and socioeconomic stability. She, like you and me, she wants to grow up and grow old with the love of her life, Elimelech, her husband. She has two small children, Mahlon and Chilion, which are terrible names for sons. They actually mean weakly and sickly, so there you go. But she loves these kids to death. She loves them to death, and like every single parent, she finds herself in those moments where she thinks about their future and what kind of men they'll be like and what kind of interests they'll have, what career path they'll choose. She thinks about what kind of women that they'll end up marrying, and she wonders what kind of families that they'll end up having. She even finds herself, Naomi does, in these moments where she thinks a little bit farther out and she imagines what her retirement years will be like when her and Elimelech are retired and they have an RV and they travel around to different places and stuff like that. But she thinks about that time and she imagines what grandparenting will be like. She imagines going over to her son's house and playing with the grandkids. She imagines times when the grandkids will come over to her house and she'll feed them Coke and candy and ice cream and then send them home to mom and dad to deal with them. I mean, she just has all kinds of, like you and me, she has hopes and plans and dreams for the future. Her story starts off this way in the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and two sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. When our story starts out, we discover that in the days that the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now, the land that the narrator is talking about is actually a piece of land that's called the Promised Land. It's called the Promised Land because it was a piece of land that God promised to Abraham and all of his descendants. And multiple times over and over, people who lived in this day and age would call it the land that flowed with milk and honey. It was meant to represent a land that was prosperous, but all of a sudden, the land that flowed with milk and honey no longer flowed with milk and honey. It was ravaged by a famine. Most of us in this room probably have not experienced famine. Most of us probably never will. But for most of the world and most of human history, famine is a word that's not thrown around lightly. So what I'd like us to do for just a few minutes together is I would like us to walk in Naomi's sandals for a little bit. For a few minutes, let's just suspend reality, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to pretend that you are Naomi. When you get married to Elimelech, everything seems so promising. He comes from a family with means and money. When you first married is not an issue. In fact, almost immediately, as soon as you get married, you guys start planning for the future. You put some money away in savings and you start working on your 401k and things like that. And then you get pregnant, you have a son, and that's exciting. And then you get pregnant and you have another son, and that's exciting. And everything kind of bumps along just fine. Until all of a sudden, seemingly without warning, there's an economic depression that hits the land. And it's not just a minor depression, it's Great Depression type of depression. You know, everybody you know seems to be getting laid off from work. And you try to comfort yourself. You'd say, well, it probably won't happen to Elimelech. You know, he's talented and he's been with the company a long time and everything's probably going to be just fine. But one day, Elimelech comes home from work early. And he doesn't have to say a word. His body and his face, they say everything. You know that Elimelech has lost his job. You comfort yourself again by telling yourself, you know, it's just going to be temporary. It's not that big a deal. This thing will pass. But you go to work making the adjustments to your lifestyle. You stop eating out, you start eating at home every time, and you stop buying name brand stuff, you start buying the generic stuff, and you shop at Sam's to buy in bulk to save money for your family. And you just tell yourself it's going to be okay, it's a very, very short period of time. But 6 months pass and things are actually worse. And then a year, and 2 years. And the depression is still there, and Elimelech still doesn't have a job. Things are getting more and more desperate. You've burned through your savings and you burned through your 401k. And now you've had to resort to selling things just so people can eat in your family. You sell furniture and you sell cars, and eventually you sell the house. You used to have these thoughts about the future and these plans for the future. You used to think about retirement. You used to think about where are we going to go on vacation the next year. But all of a sudden, the only thing you can think about every single day, every single waking moment of that day is what are we going to eat and when are we going to get to eat again? Your kids are wearing clothes, the same pair of clothes that they've been wearing for the last week. And they'll probably continue to wear those same pair of clothes without being washed for the next week. And as you look at your kids, they're getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner every single day. You know you're going to get to eat tomorrow. You've managed to scrounge up enough pennies to purchase a pack of ramen noodles that your family's going to split 4 ways. And who knows when you'll get to eat again. And there's something inside of you that says, if something doesn't happen soon, we're going to lose everything. And then Elimelech comes home one day. And he starts out this way. He says, look, I know this is going to sound crazy. And I know that you're probably not going to want to do this, but hear me out. I've heard that in Moab that there's not a famine there. And I can actually get a job. Naomi, I think we need to go to Moab. And yes, Naomi, I mean it. I know they don't like us there. I know if we go there, we're going to be considered a foreigner and they're going to mistreat us. And look, I know that it means that we're going to have to adjust everything about everything we've ever been comfortable with. We're going to have to learn new language and new culture and all kinds of stuff. And Naomi, I know this is also a no-no for an Israelite. Like I know this has implications on our faith. And God's been very clear. This is not something we should do. But Naomi, if we don't go, our kids are going to die. Our sons are getting thinner and thinner every single day, Naomi. And Naomi, if it helps you, we're not going to stay there long. We're just going to go for a little while. You don't like the plan. But quite frankly, there aren't a whole lot of options. So you acquiesce. And you gather together the few meager belongings that you have left, and you start making your way to Moab. And you comfort yourself again by saying, you know, the most important things that I have in this life, the things that I love the most, they're going with me, my sons and my husband. Everything else can be replaced. But my sons and my husband, they can't be replaced. And since I have them, there's hope for the future because the family name will go on. The future can be better than the present. You get to Moab, and sure enough, Elimelech finds a job. And now you're able to eat on a daily basis, and you start to think, wow, maybe Elimelech was right. Maybe this is gonna be okay. And then one day Elimelech gets sick. And instead of getting better, he day by day gets worse and worse and worse and worse and weaker and weaker and weaker and sicker and sicker and sicker. And the longer it goes on, the weaker your hope becomes. And you beg and you plead and you bargain with God. God, help. God, do something. God, if we could, whatever you got to do, I'll do whatever. You want me to do this, I'll do that. And Elimelech dies anyway. And when he does, so does your hope. I mean, he was your rock. He had this way of looking at you and telling you, everything's gonna be okay. We're gonna get through this. It'll get better. And even when everything else told you it wasn't, when he said it, you believed it. And all of a sudden, there's this unbelievable grief that ushers its way into your life, a soul-crushing grief that you can't even figure out how to navigate. You're not sure what to tell your sons. You're not sure how to help your sons. You're not even sure how to help yourself. But you have two sons that are depending on you. And because of them, you try to be strong. And you put a plan together, and everybody goes and they find these menial jobs around town, and when they come home, the three of you put all your pennies together, and it's enough to eat and make do, and that's how you live. Just trying your best to raise your sons. And sure enough, they grow up and they fall in love and they get married to Moabite women. You struggle with it, quite honestly, because this wasn't part of your plan. This wasn't how you pictured the future going. This is an interracial marriage, and you're not sure how to navigate it. It's uneasy and uncertain, but your sons love these women, and these women clearly love your sons, and so you try to make it work. And the more you start thinking about things, you start to realize, well, maybe grandchildren are in my future. Maybe the future looks different than I thought, but it can still be good. And you start to long for and dream about grandkids. And 1 year goes by, and 2 years goes by, and 3 years goes by, and 10 years goes by, and still no grandchild. And with every passing year, hope dies over again and over again and over again and over again. And then the unspeakable happens, or the unthinkable. You go to visit your sons and you find out that they are sick too. And as soon as you walk into the room, it's like a deja vu moment. It's like you're watching your husband again lying on that bed, getting sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker. And you have flashbacks, and it ushers all the grief back into your life. And you pray and you beg and you bargain with God again. And as you sit by your son's bedside, you can't help but think about the first time you held them. You can't help but think about that first step they took where everybody celebrated. You can't help but think about that first time they said mom, and what it did to your heart. And you were super pumped they said mom before dad. You think back to a time when you used to kiss their boo-boos, and it would make everything better. And you know it's silly. You know it probably won't work. But you're desperate. And you lean over the bed of your dying son and you kiss him, hoping that you can make the boo-boo better. But it doesn't work. and your sons die anyway. I think it's fair to say this is not the future Naomi dreamed of. I'm pretty sure that this wasn't the plan. And you know, I believe that we've all probably been in moments like the one that Naomi is in. If you haven't been there, live a bit more life, and you will be in a moment like this one day. A moment when the dreams fall apart and the plan fails and the future looks bleak at best. For some of you, it happened because of something that you did, choices you made, places you went, things that you said. And in your more honest moments, you know you're at fault. For others of us, it happened in moments that where other people did things, or maybe for some of us, it happened in moments where we just encountered circumstances that were so wildly beyond our control, we just had to navigate whatever it was that we were in the middle of. But we've all been there, or we all will be there one day. All of us. Now for Naomi, the situation actually gets worse because they are in a highly male-dominated society, and women were extremely dependent. And I'm not saying this is right, I'm just saying this is the way it was. But women were extremely dependent upon men for both protection and provision. And all Naomi has now are two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And she finds herself sitting in the wreckage of her shattered hopes and dreams. Now, what Naomi doesn't realize is that there's actually hope in this moment. You and I oftentimes miss it too, and I'm sure that Naomi did as well. The story continues in verse 6, and it goes this way. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So while Naomi is sitting there in the middle of her devastation, in the middle of the wreckage of her shattered hopes and dreams, she gets word that God has ended the famine in Bethlehem. And Naomi doesn't realize it, but she's actually bumped into an important truth that the book of Ruth screams out to us over and over and over again. Naomi doesn't realize it, but there's hope, and here's why. There's hope because God works under the surface and behind the scenes. I mean, that's where he does most of his work. In the moments when we're not aware, in the moments when we don't see it happening, God is doing 1,000 different things under the surface and behind the scenes to bring him glory and bring ultimate good into our lives. You know, the interesting thing about the book of Ruth is that if you take the book of Ruth and you set it next to any other book of the Bible, Genesis, Jonah, Daniel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, when you set it next to them, there's something that's distinctively true about the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, you don't find anything miraculous happening. You don't read stories about God parting bodies of water and people walking across on dry land. You don't read stories about men walking into a fiery furnace and not even a hair on their head being singed. You don't read stories about a big fish swallowing a man for 3 days and he lives. You don't read stories about somebody walking on water. There's no wild, miraculous answer to prayer. There's no grand revelation from God. When you read through the book of Ruth, you know what you find? You find normal people, average people like you and me, living in very difficult times, making rather mundane decisions. Where are we going to go? Where are we going to eat? What are we going to eat? But in spite of that, in spite of the lack of seemingly miraculous, God's fingerprints are all over the entire story. It was God who ended the famine. And in every chapter that we cover together through the story of Ruth, we're going to discover that God does something. And I'm not going to tell you everything because I want you to go home and read it. But God does something, moving behind the scenes and under the surface. And that's really good news for us. I love the way that one scholar put it. He said, God is most powerfully present even when he seems most conspicuously absent. God's always at work, even in our darkest moments, under the surface and behind the scenes. So Naomi gathers together her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, when she hears about the famine being ended. And she tells them, look, we are going to Bethlehem. So they go to work gathering together the few supplies that they have, the ones that they try to sort through. We need this, okay, we don't need this, and all that sort of stuff. For Ruth and Orpah, this is a very, very daunting trip for them. It means literally leaving everything that's comfortable for them. Their language, their culture, everything they've ever known. Chances are they have never even crossed over the border of the village that they live in, and now they're about to take a journey to a place they have never been. For Naomi, this decision comes with a mixed bag of feelings. For her, on one hand, she's excited about the fact that she gets to go back to a place called home, that she called home for most of her life, a place that was kind of familiar. And she's probably very excited about shedding that foreigner label because the people in Moab have been tolerant for the most part, but they don't like her and she knows it. But on the other hand, this is a very emotional trip for her, because she knows that home probably isn't the same as when she left it, and she doesn't know what is it going to look like and what's going to be left and who's going to be there and how's it changed. And the one thing that she knows for certain is that every single place and every single interaction that she has when she goes back home is going to do nothing but remind her of the loss in her life. Every single place, every single conversation is going to be a reminder that Elimelech isn't there. Every single place and every single conversation is going to be a reminder that Mahlon and Chilion are no longer alive. In so many ways, Naomi is going back to Bethlehem, not to live, but to die. She does not want to die in Moab. So she gathers her daughters-in-law together and they start making the trip. And somewhere along the line, before they get to Bethlehem, Naomi starts to think about her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And she starts to think about the prospects that they would have in Bethlehem and what their life would be like. And so she stops them and she says, gals, I love you, but you have got to go back to Moab. You stay here. If you stay here, you can still have a good life. You can find protection in your father's house. You probably will be able to find somebody to marry. You can have sons and you can have a good life. Where I'm going, life is going to be difficult for me. And because you're a foreigner, it's going to be worse for you. Stay here. I love you, but stay here. And at first they resisted. At first they said, no, we're going. And then she started to reason with them. And eventually Orpah started to go, well, yeah, that makes sense. So Orpah hugs her mother-in-law, kisses her cheek, and turns around and walks towards home. One scholar says that she walked home and she walked off the pages of biblical history. We don't even know if she got home. Ruth says, no, I'm staying here with you. And Naomi tries one more time. Look at your sister-in-law. See what she's doing. You need to follow her back home. And I want you to read, and I want you to hear what Ruth says next, because this is nothing short of incredible. In verse 16, she says this, don't urge me, talking to Naomi, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. In other words, Naomi, you need to stop trying. There's no amount of emotional appeal. There's no amount of logic. There's no amount of reason. There's no amount of begging that you can do to change my mind. I am going to do this. And then she makes Naomi these incredible promises. She says, look, where you go, I'll go. No exception clauses, no fine print. Naomi, I'm going to go wherever you go. And she knows she's going to Bethlehem. But if Naomi would have said, all right, look, we're going to South Africa, Ruth would have been like, all right, let me get directions. That's incredible. Where you go, I'll go, and where you stay, I will stay. And you know the grand irony of this statement is Naomi is homeless. Look, I realize you're living out of a cardboard box, and I'm going to go live in that cardboard box with you. And Naomi, I'm not asking for your permission. Naomi, I'm not asking for you to ask me. I'm not asking for you to be grateful. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just going to do this. I mean, this is staggering. She continues, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. I grew up with these customs and this language and this way of going about things. But now, Naomi, I'm going to your people, and I'm going to adopt every single way of life that they have. And Naomi, I know these people won't like me, and I know they won't appreciate me, and I know I'll always be a foreigner to them, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then she says, and your God, my God. That's incredible. Look, she tells Naomi, look, Naomi, I know because you told me in the process of all this that God has dealt you a bad hand, and you're struggling to trust him. But in spite of that, Naomi, I'm choosing to trust your God. Your God is now going to be my God. She continues, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Which doesn't sound to you and me like that big a deal, but in ancient times, that was a big, big, big deal. Everybody, and when I mean everybody, wanted to be buried with their family in the family burial plot. Everybody. It was a huge deal. In fact, when you read through your Old Testament, you'll read these stories about people who went to extraordinary lengths to go be buried with their family because it was a big deal. And what Ruth is saying to Naomi is he's saying, look, if you think I'm done once you die with this promise, that's not how this is going to go. From here on out, you're family. You are family. Now, I might have married into this before and you might have given me an out, but I am choosing right now in this moment until the day that I die, and even once I'm dead and buried, we are family. This is extraordinary. The thing is that Naomi has lost her identity by accident. Ruth is willingly flinging hers aside. She continues, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely. And I imagine that when Ruth says this, she kind of takes her finger and she pulls it across her throat like that. May it be ever so severely. If even death separates you and me. And you want to know why this is an incredible statement? Because Ruth has heard about Naomi's God, and she has heard that on occasion he deals out some pretty hefty punishment. She's heard about the frogs and the lice and the boils and the firstborn son thing that happened in Egypt. She knows for people who steer away, there's going to be some hefty punishment. And in spite of all of it, she's so convinced and her mind is so made up that she's like, okay, if that's what, he can do that to me if he wants to too, if I break my vow. It's incredible. Naomi, we are family. And that's not going to change. Well, Naomi realizes that she cannot dissuade Ruth. And so they begin to make the journey to Bethlehem, a journey that probably took somewhere between 4 and 7 days. And when they get to Bethlehem, here's what we read. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? So we're used to thinking about Bethlehem as the sprawling metropolis that it is now. But at this point in human history, in this point in time, the city or really village of Bethlehem was probably between about 100 to 200 people. So Naomi knows everybody knows of her, and there's this everybody type thing. And so when somebody sees Naomi coming in the distance, word travels fast. They're like, oh my goodness, Naomi's back. We didn't think we'd ever see her again. And people literally spill out of their homes and they make their way to the city gate to welcome Naomi. Naomi and Ruth get to the city gate, and you would sort of expect this sort of family reunion thing to almost happen. Hey, how you doing? How's your kids? You look good, that sort of stuff. But here's what Naomi does. She says, don't call me Naomi. Naomi, by the way, means pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. Pleasant isn't this way you should describe me anymore. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. And she doesn't stop there. She continues, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. No, hey, how you doing? Hey, good to see you. Just this angry rant. Now, when Naomi says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty, you know what she's talking about there? She's talking about her husband and her 2 sons. She's talking about her family. She's talking about the family that meant that she would have a future, the family that meant that the family name would go on. She's not just talking about, I was full emotionally, because she probably wasn't, and I've come back empty emotionally, although she probably is. She's saying, look, I had a future, I had prospects, I had a family, and now I have none of that. And the crazy thing to me is she's saying it while Ruth is standing right here. She's saying, I have no family, I have no one, I have no future. And if I'm Ruth, I'm thinking, what the heck? Like, I'm right here. I can hear you, right? Like, I'm right here. Naomi completely misses what's standing right next to her. What's interesting to me is by the end of the story, and I'm not going to fill in all the details for you because, again, I want you to go home and read the book of Ruth. It's just an incredible story. But by the time the story is over, these same women that Naomi has said this to, they end up telling Naomi, Ruth is better for you than 7 sons. Which is a big deal in ancient times because sons were like the gold standard. They represented future, they represented hope. Everybody wanted a son. And 7 is the number of perfection for them. And so when they say that to Naomi, they're essentially saying, look, she far exceeds anything that you could have ever imagined. She's a far better gift from God than you could have ever thought possible. And when Naomi rants about God, Ruth is standing right next to her. Which brings me to another important truth that the book of Ruth teaches us, and it's one that Naomi had completely missed. There's hope in the story, and here's why. God often works in ways that we'd never expect. But Naomi missed it. She missed it because she had a plan for her life. And although she probably wouldn't have said it, subtly, Naomi thought she knew better than God about how her life should go. And because of it, she missed one of God's greatest gifts, standing right next to her, right there under her nose. And this can happen to us too. It really can. And here's how it normally happens. We have an agenda. And sometimes our agenda, our plan, doesn't line up with God's agenda and God's plan. And when that happens, there's a collision. And like Naomi, we look for someone to blame, and oftentimes God is the one that we blame. And we tell him, you're not good, and you're not kind, and you don't care, and you've abandoned me. all the while potentially missing the greatest gift he's ever given us that may be right underneath our nose. When you look through the Bible, God has a strong track record of using things that we would never expect, often turning them into some of the greatest gifts he's ever given. He uses widows, he uses orphans, he uses weakness, he uses struggle, and he once even used a Roman cross. He oftentimes uses things that we would just never expect. So the storyteller finishes out chapter 1 like this. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. It seems like a strange way to finish out the first section of your story with a kind of recap of the obvious. But I think that the author is doing this on purpose. I think the author, that the storyteller wants us to not miss what has happened. So he tells us again, in the beginning there was a famine, and now there's a harvest. In the beginning, Naomi had a husband and 2 sons, but now she has a Ruth, someone who's better than 7 sons. I think the author, it's important to him, and the storyteller, that it's important to him that you and I don't miss that even in our darkest times, that God is at work, just like he was in Ruth and Naomi's life, behind the scenes and under the surface. And oftentimes he uses things that become the greatest gift he's ever given us, but they're things that we just would never expect. The conclusion that I think the storyteller wants us to arrive at is simply this, that God is at work in the darkest times. I want you to know God is at work in the middle of your dark time. God is at work in the middle of your marriage that is falling apart. God is at work in your career that hasn't gone the way that you want it to go. God is at work in your struggle with your child. God is at work in the middle of your health issue. God is at work in the middle of your financial difficulty, in the middle of your unemployment. God's at work in the middle of your dark times. Under the scenes and behind the surface. And potentially his greatest gift in the middle of it is something that you would not expect. But God is at work. So here's what I want to encourage you to do. Don't sell God short in the dark times. If all you have is a thread of faith left, and everything inside of you is just trying to cling to what's left of it, and you can't see what God is doing, and you wonder if he's even there, don't sell him short. Because here's what I believe, in hindsight, just like Ruth and just like Naomi and Boaz, as we're going to be introduced to later on in the story, that if we don't sell God short in the dark times, what we discover in hindsight oftentimes is that God is faithful and that God is good and that God did know and that God was doing something. And sometimes even the dark times can be the greatest gift. Don't sell God short in the dark times.